Imagine a world where your morning doesn't start with coffee, but with a deep bow to your ancestors. A world where what you wear, eat, and even think is controlled by a system that sees you more as a tool than a person. Welcome to Feudal China, one of history's most fascinating yet fearsome civilizations. This isn't your average history lesson. We're diving into the real, raw, and often brutal lives behind the silk curtains and stone walls. From genius inventions to ruthless punishments, arranged marriages to secret palace plots, this story has it all. If you think you know what ancient China was like, think again. I'm Thunga, and this is Story Time, where history gets personal. Let's begin. Waking up in feudal China, duty before desire. Imagine opening your eyes not to the buzz of an alarm clock, but to the soft rustle of bamboo leaves in the morning breeze. There's no choice to sleep in, no time to stretch and yawn. Your day begins with obligation, not to yourself, but to others, to your parents, to your ancestors, and to a rigid social system that has already decided who you are and who you will be. This was life in feudal China, a land of majestic emperors, elegant poetry, breathtaking inventions, and overwhelming control. A civilization admired for its contributions to the world, yet bound by layers of tradition, hierarchy, and duty. In this world, individual freedom was not only rare, it was often viewed as a threat. Society set in stone, the social pyramid. At the very top of this towering social order sat the emperor, known as the Son of Heaven. His rule was absolute, believed to be divinely ordained. No law existed above his word, no higher power to question him, except, perhaps, the mandate of heaven, a philosophical concept that justified rebellion if an emperor failed morally or politically. Directly beneath him were the scholar officials, men who had passed grueling state examinations in Confucian philosophy. They weren't just bureaucrats, they were moral authorities, educated elites who advised the emperor and enforced the laws of the land. Their high status came not from wealth, but from intellectual achievement and supposed ethical superiority. Then came the peasants, hard-working farmers who toiled from dawn to dusk to feed the empire. Unlike in some other ancient societies, Chinese peasants were respected in principle. After all, they produced food, the most basic necessity of life. But make no mistake, their lives were anything but easy. Many lived in poverty, burdened by taxes, droughts, and the ever-present threat of conscription or forced labor on imperial projects. Beneath the peasants were the artisans and craftsmen. They made tools, furniture, pottery, and other goods essential to daily life. Their work was skilled and valuable, but they didn't hold much social prestige. Even lower in social respect, though often wealthier, were the merchants. Why? Because Confucian thought regarded them with suspicion. Merchants were seen as parasites. They didn't produce anything, they only bought and sold for profit. In a system that prized morality, humility, and service, profit-seeking was frowned upon. The bottom rungs, the disregarded and the disempowered. At the very bottom of the social ladder were those considered socially tainted or morally impure. This included soldiers, despite their importance to national defense. It also included domestic servants, actors, musicians, prostitutes, criminals, and others who were seen as existing outside the moral or productive structure of society. Women, regardless of class, occupied a consistently subordinate role. Whether born into nobility or a farming family, a woman's identity was tied to the men in her life, her father, her husband, her sons. Confucian teachings emphasized the three obediences. A woman was expected to obey her father before marriage, her husband after marriage, and her sons in widowhood. Freedom? Autonomy? These were luxuries few could imagine, especially if you were born female. Your place was not a choice, it was your fate. In this deeply hierarchical world, social mobility was possible, but rare. If you were born a peasant, chances were high that you would die a peasant. The primary path upward was through the civil service examination system, but passing these tests required years of study, and money for tutors and time away from work. Most couldn't afford the luxury of learning Confucian classics by candlelight. What mattered more than your dreams was your duty, to your family, your ancestors, your emperor, and your role in society. You were not an individual in the modern sense. You were a part of a whole, a cog in the grand machine of the empire. Even at birth, your destiny was dictated by your class, your gender, and your family's fortune or failure. Why it matters today. Feudal China lasted for over 2 millennia. Its strict social codes and enduring traditions helped maintain order across an enormous and diverse empire. But this order came at a cost: stifled potential, gender oppression, and harsh inequalities. The story of this era is a reminder that cultural brilliance can coexist with deep injustice, and that while traditions can bind a society together, they can also prevent it from evolving. Understanding feudal China means looking beyond the stunning calligraphy and majestic palaces. It means seeing the millions of ordinary people who lived within its system, not as emperors, but as farmers, craftsmen, servants, and silent daughters. Rituals before breakfast, the sacred duty of respect. In feudal China, daily life was not just about survival, it was about reverence. From the moment one awoke, The day unfolded not according to personal preference or spontaneity, but according to custom, order, and obligation. Central to this structure was the unshakable principle of filial piety, the Confucian ideal that shaped every household, every generation, and every action. Forget to honor your ancestors? Disobey your parents? That wasn't simply rude, it was considered a moral failing, even a sin. The morning begins with a bow. For children, the day did not start with a yawn or play, it began on their knees. Literally. Each morning, before eating or even speaking freely, they were expected to bow deeply to their parents and grandparents. Often, this ritual would be repeated 3 or more times, a physical act meant to express submission, loyalty, and gratitude. In wealthier households, this might take place in front of a formal altar in the main hall. In humble homes, it could be as simple as kneeling on the packed earth floor beside the family hearth. Regardless of setting, the meaning was sacred. This was not a gesture done out of habit or fear, it was woven into the moral DNA of the culture. Children were taught from their earliest days that they owed everything to those who came before them. Life itself was a gift from their ancestors, and it was to be repaid with absolute respect. Ancestor worship, the heart of the home. In every home, from mud brick cottages to palace chambers, there was a space set aside for the ancestors. Often, it was a small shrine or table with wooden name tablets, painted portraits, or incense holders. Here, family members would burn incense, offer bowls of rice or tea, and silently communicate with those who had passed on. The belief was that ancestors continued to watch over the family, protecting them from illness, misfortune, or failure. If they were honored properly, they would bless the household. If neglected, they might bring curses or bad luck. Ancestor worship was not optional. It was a spiritual contract, a two-way relationship that tied the living to the dead in a loop of memory, obligation, and reverence. Respect was a daily practice, not a holiday. While modern Americans might associate family traditions with holidays like Thanksgiving or religious observances, in feudal China, these practices were part of daily life. Respect wasn't reserved for special occasions, it was expected at every meal, every greeting, every decision. Sons were taught to obey without question. Daughters, in particular, were raised to be gentle, quiet, and ever mindful of how their behavior reflected on the family's honor. Even tone of voice mattered. Speaking too loudly or using the wrong posture could be interpreted as disrespect. These weren't just personal choices, they were measures of moral character. Food and ritual intertwined. Before meals, especially in traditional families, a small portion of food might be set aside for the ancestors. The act wasn't just symbolic, it was seen as real nourishment offered to the spirits of the departed. Only after this gesture was complete could the family begin to eat. Meals themselves were often eaten in strict silence, or with only subdued conversation. The eldest male would eat first, followed by others in descending order of age and status. Children didn't speak unless spoken to. Laughing loudly at the table? A serious breach of etiquette. Even the act of passing food had to be done with 2 hands, as a mark of politeness. When respect wasn't shown, social and legal consequences. Disrespecting one's parents wasn't just frowned upon, it could have legal consequences. Confucian ideals were deeply embedded in law. In many dynasties, striking a parent or grandparent was a criminal offense that could lead to public punishment, exile, or even execution. In one infamous historical case, a young man who raised his voice at his mother in public was beaten and paraded through the streets as a warning to others. His crime? Failing in his filial duties. Even within the home, the consequences could be just as serious. A child who dishonored the family might be disinherited, sent away, or permanently shamed. In many families, honor was everything. Lose it, and you might as well be dead. Filial piety as a social glue. Why was this system so powerful? Because it worked. Filial piety created stability. It ensured that younger generations cared for the old, upheld family values, and preserved traditions across centuries. In a society without modern welfare systems or retirement plans, family was the only safety net, and that net was built on obedience, loyalty, and ritual. It also reinforced a broader social hierarchy. Just as children were expected to submit to their parents, citizens were expected to submit to the emperor, soldiers to generals, wives to husbands. It was a system of mirrored obedience, from the household to the empire. A legacy that still echoes. Even today, echoes of these traditions remain in Chinese culture, through ancestral festivals, family hierarchies, and expectations of respect for elders. But in feudal China, these weren't simply cultural choices, they were moral imperatives, daily acts of devotion that shaped identity, behavior, and belief. For Americans raised with values of independence and individualism, it may be difficult to imagine a world where personal feelings were always second to family duty. But in feudal China, what you wanted mattered less than who you owed. And every morning, before the sun had fully risen. That truth was expressed in a humble bow to the ones who came before. Simple meals in a strict world, eating in feudal China. After the morning rituals of bows and incense, families in feudal China moved on to the next act of the day, breakfast. But don't picture bacon, eggs, or steaming stacks of pancakes. In this world, breakfast, and most meals, were about survival, not indulgence. Food was simple, repetitive, and dictated by necessity rather than flavor. This was not a time of choice, variety, or abundance for most. It was a time of scarcity, modesty, and humility at the table. The humble start, thin rice porridge. The most common breakfast across much of China was congee, a watery rice porridge, barely more than a handful of grains boiled down in water. It was filling, warm, and easy to digest, but rarely satisfying in the way Americans might think of breakfast. There were no toppings, no sweeteners, no bacon on the side. At best, you might find a pinch of salt, a bit of fermented bean paste, or a few slices of pickled vegetables added to the bowl. Occasionally, if the family had them, bits of dried tofu or green onion might be mixed in. But for most peasants and laborers, the congee was just plain, a quiet, bland beginning to a long day of labor. And yet, this meal was treated with the same respect as a banquet. Meals were never casual. They were quiet, disciplined, and often ritualized. Meat, the rare guest at the table. For the majority of the population, meat was a luxury, not a staple. It might be served a few times a year, during religious festivals, weddings, or the celebration of a successful harvest. On those days, it was shared among many, small portions stretched to feed large extended families. If you were a farmer or laborer, your daily protein might come from soybeans, tofu, or scraps of dried fish. Chickens were kept more for eggs than for meat. Pigs, if a family could raise one, were often saved for special occasions, or sold for cash. Only the wealthy elite, scholar officials, and nobles could afford regular servings of pork, duck, or beef. And even then, moderation was the norm. There were no buffets or belly-stuffing feasts. A dignified meal was not about quantity, but about control, order, and balance. Tea, more medicine than pleasure. One thing nearly everyone drank was tea, not as a luxury or a social drink, but out of practical necessity. Water sources were often contaminated, especially in rural areas or near cities. Boiling water was essential to avoid illness, and tea leaves added a touch of flavor and mild antiseptic qualities. So even the poorest families might keep a small pouch of tea leaves, used sparingly, steeped multiple times. It wasn't about enjoying the aroma or savoring the taste. It was about staying alive. In wealthier homes, tea rituals were more refined. Guests were served with special cups, steeped leaves were admired, and tea culture became an art form. But in the average village, tea was boiled, sipped quickly, and appreciated mostly for what it prevented: dysentery, parasites, and worse, a culture of restraint and routine. The simplicity of food in feudal China was more than just economic, it was cultural. Confucianism emphasized moderation, discipline, and humility. Overeating was seen as indulgent, even immoral. Eating was not for pleasure but for function, to sustain the body so it could serve the family, the ancestors, and the empire. Children were expected to wait for their elders to eat first. Plates were never heaped. Waste was almost unthinkable. Every grain of rice mattered. Farmers knew how much effort it took to grow food, and that reverence passed down through generations. To throw food away was to insult both nature and labor. Simple pleasures in a hard life. Despite the scarcity, people still found small joys in their meals. A sweetened rice cake during New Year's. A bowl of noodles shared with friends. A bit of duck fat saved from a winter feast, used to flavor a pot of greens weeks later. These moments were treasured, precisely because they were rare. Children would beg for sesame candies during market festivals. Elderly women might pass down secret recipes for dumplings, not written down, but remembered through hands and repetition. The act of preparing food, washing rice, chopping ginger, stoking the hearth, was itself a form of meditation, a shared experience that bonded generations. And for a society where words of affection were rare, a bowl of warm food offered with both hands could say everything. Feeding the many, communal cooking. In villages, cooking was often a communal affair. Neighbors might share a clay oven. Extended families lived together, so meals were cooked in large pots to feed dozens. In times of hardship, floods, famine, war, families combined resources to survive. One household might offer millet, another a handful of garlic, a third the labor to prepare it. Cooperation was a matter of survival. Even in cities, street vendors played a vital role, serving hot soup, steamed buns, or tea eggs to workers and travelers. These meals weren't extravagant, but they kept people moving, building, laboring, keeping the empire alive. What the table reveals. The dining habits of feudal China reveal more than just what people ate. They show how people lived, with discipline, with duty, with deep awareness of scarcity and gratitude. In a world where everything was earned through sweat and sacrifice, even a thin bowl of congee could carry the weight of love, respect, and resilience. Meals were not escapes from daily life. They were reflections of it, humble, ordered, and steeped in centuries of meaning. Clothing and class, what you wore was who you were. In feudal China, your clothing wasn't just what you put on each morning, it was your social identity stitched into fabric. Every thread you wore told the world who you were, where you stood, and, just as importantly, who you were not. Unlike in modern America, where fashion is a form of self-expression, in feudal China, fashion was regulation. It was hierarchy. It was law. Fabric is a social barcode. The materials alone separated people like invisible fences. Peasants wore rough hemp or rami, scratchy and durable, good for working the fields. Their clothes were often undyed, drab gray or brown, designed for function over appearance. Artisans and merchants, even if wealthier, were legally restricted in their attire, often confined to cotton or coarse cloth with limited colors. The nobility and scholar officials had the exclusive right to wear silk, a symbol of refinement, literacy, and power. These robes flowed with elegance and were dyed in vivid colors, deep blue, jade green, crimson, each shade with its own meaning. You didn't need to ask someone their rank or background. You could read it in their sleeves. The law of the robes. Clothing in feudal China was regulated by strict sumptuary laws, legal codes that dictated who could wear what based on status, gender, and occupation. These laws outlined everything from fabric types, color schemes, embroidery patterns, even sleeve length and hat shape. Violating these laws wasn't just a fashion faux pas, it was a crime. A peasant caught wearing silk could face steep fines or corporal punishment. Pretending to be of higher status was seen as both deception and social rebellion. It wasn't just about respect, it was about maintaining the order of the empire, one robe at a time. Uniforms of service and shame. Certain groups, especially those at the bottom of society, had their own enforced uniforms. Soldiers and laborers wore padded jackets or leather vests, marked by wear and dust. Servants and slaves often wore dark, featureless clothing that signified their obedience and invisibility. Criminals, when caught, could be forced to wear branding patches or clothing with embroidered characters announcing their crimes. You were always on display, your identity stitched plainly onto your back. Beauty, pain, and bound feet. Among noble women, especially during the Song, Ming, and Qing dynasties, beauty and class were quite literally tied to how small your feet were. This was the era of foot binding, a brutal practice that began in childhood. Young girls, usually from elite families, had their feet tightly wrapped in cloth, breaking the arch and forcing the toes under. The goal? To shape the foot into a lotus, no longer than 3 or 4 inches. A woman with bound feet couldn't run. Often, she could barely walk without assistance. And that was the point. In a culture where female virtue was tied to obedience, fragility, and domesticity, bound feet were proof that a woman belonged to a wealthy house, that she didn't need to labor in the fields. Her pain was a sign of her family's prestige. American readers might compare it to wearing a corset, but foot binding was far more permanent and irreversible. The masculine ideal, modesty and authority. For men, especially scholar officials, the ideal was not physical strength but moral strength. Robes were loose-fitting and high-collared, emphasizing modesty, intellect, and authority. Hats, too, signaled rank, especially the winged hats worn by officials, with side flaps that discouraged turning your head, and by extension, gossip or distraction. An upright appearance reflected an upright soul. Even posture mattered. To slouch was to dishonor your rank. Dress as discipline. For most people, dressing each day was not about personal style, it was a ritual of discipline and submission to a larger order. You wore what you were allowed to wear, not what you liked. The wrong color could cost you status. The wrong embroidery could cost you your freedom. Even within families, hierarchy shaped attire. A younger brother might wear shorter sleeves than his elder. A widow might be expected to wear unadorned white or pale blue for the rest of her life. Children's clothing was often simple, but respectful, meant to train them early to know their place. Exceptions and rebellions. Of course, not everyone conformed. In border regions, among ethnic minorities or during times of rebellion, people defied the dress codes, sometimes in secret, sometimes openly. Female warriors disguised themselves as men. Merchants quietly commissioned forbidden silks. Some criminals, before execution, were dressed in noble robes by sympathetic families, to grant them dignity in death, if not in life. But these were rare acts of defiance in a system that rewarded conformity and punished individualism. Clothes that kept the empire together. In feudal China, clothing was never just clothing. It was a visual system of control, an everyday performance of loyalty and hierarchy. It defined who you could speak to, marry, or work with. It even shaped how you saw yourself. When everyone looked like their station, society remained legible, predictable, stable. And in an empire that spanned mountains, rivers, and generations, that predictability was everything. A life of labor, The empire runs on backs, not wheels. In the sprawling world of feudal China, daily life was not cushioned by comfort or choice, it was driven by relentless work. From dawn until darkness, the empire ran on the sweat of the lower classes, even as their contributions were often invisible to the elite. Whether in the rice paddies or the imperial workshops, labor wasn't a part of life, it was life. For many, the day began with a bowed head and ended with an aching back. Farming, the backbone of the nation. The vast majority of China's population were farmers, and their labor fed the empire, literally and figuratively. These peasants, often tied to the land through generations, woke before the sun and returned home long after it set. They worked in rice paddies, wheat fields, tea terraces, and mulberry orchards. Their tools were simple: wooden plows, oxen, baskets, and their efforts endless. Irrigation ditches had to be cleared by hand. Crops had to be sown, tended, and harvested under threat of flood, drought, or locusts. If the harvest was poor, they starved. If it was good, they still owed taxes and grain to landlords or the imperial granary. There was no real off-season, just shifts and duties: patching roofs, tending animals, repairing roads, and honoring seasonal rituals. Farming wasn't just a job, it was a way of surviving under the weight of constant expectation. Women worked twice. Feudal China's ideals placed women behind men in the social hierarchy, but in labor, they were front and center. Rural women worked both in the fields and in the home, often with no recognition. They planted, weeded, harvested, fed animals, fetched water, wove cloth, raised children, cooked meals, and still had to bow to in-laws before bedtime. In wealthier households, they managed servants and maintained the household's internal economy, often behind the scenes. Their work was non-stop and undervalued, their fatigue worn in silence. And for those of lower status, there was no rest from labor after marriage, only more of it, done under the watchful eyes of both husband and mother-in-law. The craftsman's clock never stops. Artisans, blacksmiths, weavers, potters, carpenters, and masons formed a vital part of the empire's infrastructure. Many worked in family-run workshops, honing their trade from childhood. The work was grueling, repetitive, and sometimes dangerous, especially when dealing with fire, sharp tools, or heavy materials. Despite their skills, artisans were considered lower than farmers in Confucian hierarchy, because they didn't produce food. The irony? Their labor built temples, bridges, tools, and homes. Their craft held the material culture of the nation together. And still, they weren't allowed to wear silk or hold government office. They were praised for mastery, yet rarely rewarded with upward mobility. Merchants, rich but reviled. In today's capitalist lens, merchants might be admired for entrepreneurial spirit. In feudal China, they were viewed with suspicion, even contempt. Yes, some merchants became immensely wealthy through trade: silk, spices, ceramics, tea, but they were still seen as profiting from others' labor rather than producing something themselves. This meant that even if a merchant could afford a silk robe, they weren't legally allowed to wear it. Many used their wealth to bribe officials or marry into higher classes to escape social scorn. Others hid their status or reinvested into land, ironically becoming landlords to the very farmers considered above them. Their labor was mental and transactional, not physical, but it came at a cost: permanent outsider status in a system that prized virtue over commerce. State labor, empire building by force. When you think of the Great Wall or the Grand Canal, you might picture mighty emperors or brilliant engineers. But their true story is written in calluses, bruises, and broken bodies. Throughout China's dynastic history, the state frequently imposed forced labor on common people to build massive infrastructure projects. These weren't short gigs. They could last for years, and they were often fatal. A farmer might be pulled from his village for canal dredging far from home. A blacksmith might be drafted to forge nails or hinges for palace doors. A mason might die constructing a watchtower on a frozen mountain pass. These workers were unpaid, poorly fed, and kept under guard. Some families never saw their sons or fathers again. For the empire, these projects brought control, commerce, and legacy. For the laborers, they brought exhaustion, exile, and early death. Work as control. Beyond mere survival, labor in feudal China was also a form of state and social control. The Confucian ideal valued hard work as a moral virtue. Idleness was a sign of corruption or threat. Everyone had to be busy, at home, in the fields, in the marketplace. Even those who couldn't work, the elderly, disabled, or ill, were often made to feel like burdens. This constant activity ensured obedience. A man too tired to speak was too tired to rebel. A woman overwhelmed with chores had no time for discontent. A child raised to serve knew better than to dream. Labor kept people too occupied to question the system. Invisible efforts, monumental outcomes. So much of what we admire about ancient China, its walls, bridges, roads, gardens, palaces, and poetry, rests on the backs of people whose names we will never know. They carved the stones, carried the beams, planted the trees, and shaped the clay. They worked not for fame or legacy, but for taxes, survival, or because they were ordered to. And yet, without them, the empire would have crumbled. The books that built bureaucrats, life under the imperial exam system. In a society where most people toiled endlessly in rice paddies or over glowing forges, there was one shimmering path out, the imperial examination system. This was not a lottery, nor was it a shortcut. It was a brutal marathon of the mind, and the only real way for a commoner to climb the social ranks. Success meant power, privilege, and prestige. Failure meant returning home in shame, often to a life harder than before. An early start. Childhoods devoted to books. For boys whose families dared to dream of something more, especially in the lower gentry or ambitious farming households, education began young. By age 6 or 7, a boy might be sitting cross-legged on a straw mat, chanting Confucian texts by candlelight. His first task? Memorize. Everything. Not understand. Not question. Just recite, word for word, the 4 books and 5 classics, texts attributed to Confucius and his followers. These ancient writings covered ethics, history, poetry, and political theory, but more importantly, they drilled into boys the values that underpinned imperial order, obedience, loyalty, hierarchy, and restraint. The road to advancement began not with ambition, but with rote memorization. The scholar's burden. The life of a student was mentally punishing, but not physically exempt. Most students came from modest homes. They rose early, helped with chores, and then studied for hours, often with no formal teacher, just a strict father or local tutor. There were no vacations, no weekends, no childhood. Only scrolls, ink brushes, and recitation drills. Families sacrificed enormously to support a son's education. A farmer might sell a prized ox to buy paper. A mother might go hungry so her son could pay exam fees. Whole villages pooled money to support a promising boy, hoping he'd pass and elevate their collective status. Pressure was immense, not just for the student but for everyone around him. The exam, mind game or mind trap? The exams were staged at 3 levels, local, provincial, and imperial, and each one was harder than the last. The local exams tested basic literacy and memorization. The provincial exams, held every 3 years, lasted several days and required essays, classical poetry, and knowledge of Confucian commentary. The metropolitan and palace exams, held in the capital, determined who became a scholar official, a member of the imperial bureaucracy. Testing conditions were brutal. Examinees were locked into tiny cells, roughly the size of a coffin, where they wrote with limited food, light, or sleep for up to 3 days straight. Some students collapsed from stress. A few even died. The competition was intense, hundreds of thousands applied, and fewer than 1% passed at the highest level. Success, a new life, but not without risks. To pass meant transformation. A successful candidate became a Jinchie degree holder eligible for prestigious government posts. These men wore silk, traveled with dignity, and were called master in the streets. Families celebrated with fireworks and feasts. Villages renamed gates or streets in their honor. More than just a job, passing the exam was a cultural and spiritual elevation. It proved you had virtue, not just brains. But success brought new burdens, loyalty to the emperor, scrutiny from rivals, and the expectation to govern justly. Scholar officials were caught in a constant tug-of-war between idealism and imperial politics. Failure, the quiet collapse. Most did not pass. Some failed once or twice, then gave up. Others took the exam 7, 10, even 15 times, growing old while chasing a dream that never came. Failure brought more than disappointment, it could bring humiliation. A family that had bet everything on their son might fall into poverty or lose social standing. A failed scholar had few options. He could become a low-paid village teacher, a scribe, or retreat in shame to manual labor, forever marked by his inability to make it. In a world that measured worth through text and test, to fail was to become invisible. Women shut out, but not silent. It's worth noting, this system was entirely male. Women, no matter how intelligent, were barred from official exams and government roles. Some educated women contributed poetry, ran informal salons, or even secretly tutored sons or brothers. But their potential was mostly trapped behind walls, literal and metaphorical. The exam system reinforced a patriarchal meritocracy, where merit was defined by men, for men. A system of control and continuity. While the exam system offered a sliver of mobility, it also served the state. By forcing scholars to memorize Confucian ideals, the exams produced obedient administrators, not radicals. By making success so rare and failure so common, the state ensured that even its brightest minds remained humble and hungry. This wasn't just a ladder, it was a gatekeeper, a tool of social control masquerading as opportunity. And yet, for over 1,000 years, families clung to it. Because for all its cruelty, the exam system offered something feudal China rarely did: hope. Crime and survival, hygiene and health in feudal China. In a world where one's destiny was dictated by birth and defined by duty, bodily comfort ranked low on the list of priorities. Feudal China was a civilization of immense sophistication in philosophy, governance, and art, but when it came to personal hygiene and health, life was far from pristine. If you imagine imperial palaces and ancient poetry surrounded by fragrant bathhouses and fragrant gardens, think again. For most people, cleanliness was a luxury, not a norm. The bath you didn't take. Bathing was rare, not because water was unavailable, but because time, privacy, and fuel to heat water were luxuries. Most people might wash only a few times a month. In colder regions or poor homes, even that was considered excessive. Soap, as we know it today, didn't exist. Instead, people relied on a crude substance made from animal fat and plant ash. It worked, barely. And it smelled exactly like you'd expect. For those in the working class, especially farmers and artisans, sweat and dirt were constants. After a day in the fields or at the forge, the idea of rinsing off wasn't even on the agenda. Your body was simply another tool, and tools didn't need pampering. Teeth, tools, not treasures. Dental care existed, but not in any form a modern dentist would approve of. Toothpaste didn't exist. Instead, people cleaned their teeth by rubbing them with coarse salt, charcoal powder, or ash. Bamboo or twig toothbrushes were sometimes used, but most relied on fingers. There was little understanding of plaque or cavities. Gum disease was common. Toothaches were considered normal, not alarming. If a tooth became too painful, extraction was often the only option, performed with metal tools and no anesthetic, often by someone with no formal training. Smiles were not aesthetic currency. They were functional, utilitarian, and often missing a few members. Lice, fleas, and parasites, unwanted company. In the absence of regular washing and clean bedding, parasites flourished. Lice and fleas were widespread among the lower classes, and not unheard of in the upper echelons, either. Children scratched their scalps raw. Adults developed sores from constant itching. Boiling clothes could kill some pests, but most garments were worn until they fell apart. Parasites weren't limited to the skin. With poor sanitation and limited understanding of germ theory, intestinal worms and other internal parasites were common. Stomach pain, bloating, and chronic fatigue often traced back to uninvited residents in the gut. Yet these afflictions were normalized, endured like bad weather or hunger pangs. You didn't seek treatment, you endured, because everyone else did too. The medicine of the day. Traditional Chinese medicine did offer remedies, but its effectiveness varied. Herbs, acupuncture, and cupping were used widely, some methods with genuine therapeutic value, others more symbolic. Doctors often prescribed dried animal organs, minerals, and roots, ground into powder and mixed with hot water. Snake bile, bear gallbladders, deer antlers. No creature was safe if someone believed it might bring healing. Infections, injuries, and childbirth complications could easily turn fatal. With no antibiotics and rudimentary surgery, even a minor wound might lead to sepsis. The wealthy could afford better care, more skilled physicians, rare ingredients, and healing retreats. The poor relied on folk remedies, prayers, or sheer luck. Water, life-giving, and life-threatening. Ironically, the very element associated with cleanliness was often a source of disease. Most people drank boiled water or, more commonly, tea, not for flavor, but for safety. Drinking straight from rivers or wells risked dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. Boiling water became a cultural norm not from leisure, but from sheer survival instinct. Even so, outbreaks were common. In villages where waste disposal was crude and human refuse might be used as fertilizer, night soil, waterborne illness was an ever-present danger. The privilege of cleanliness. Cleanliness in feudal China was more about status than science. The imperial family and scholar officials bathed more often, partly due to better facilities, partly to differentiate themselves from uncivilized peasants. Some had access to indoor baths, attendants, and fragrant oils. Silk robes didn't touch unwashed skin. Cleanliness became a symbol of class, not a matter of health. To be clean was to be refined. To be dirty was to be laboring, disposable, poor. And so the divide between body and soul, rich and poor, played out not only in temples and courtrooms, but in the grime beneath one's fingernails. Resilience through roughness. Despite these hardships, people endured. Children played. Adults joked about their ailments. Community rituals involved herbal steams, shared foot baths, and spiritual cleansing ceremonies. Wellness wasn't absent, it was simply different, defined more by balance and endurance than sparkle and sanitation. In a way, health in feudal China wasn't just about fighting disease, it was about coexisting with discomfort, managing what you couldn't avoid, and trusting that resilience would outlast illness. This was not a sterile world. It was a sweaty, itchy, earthy existence. But it was real. And for most, it was the only world they would ever know. Brutal justice. Fear is the backbone of law in feudal China. In a world shaped by hierarchy, duty, and sacrifice, there was one more element that held society together: fear. The judicial system of feudal China was not designed to rehabilitate or reason, it was meant to control, to warn, and to punish with chilling precision. From the emperor's palatial courts to the village squares, justice was swift, public, and unforgiving. Laws carved in bamboo and blood. Legal codes in feudal China were meticulously written, updated by each dynasty, and memorized by scholar officials. Yet for the average person, these laws felt less like guidelines and more like traps. Steal a bundle of firewood? You could be beaten in the street with a bamboo rod. Argue with a tax collector? Expect to lose teeth. Minor infractions were punished harshly to instill discipline and discourage defiance. There was no such thing as a slap on the wrist. Even the innocent could suffer. Simply being accused of wrongdoing could land you in shackles. Torture as a legal tool. Modern sensibilities recoil at the word torture, but in feudal China, it was a normalized part of due process. Confessions were considered the ultimate evidence, and officials were expected to extract them, by any means necessary. Whipping with bamboo strips. Hanging suspects by their wrists. Crushing fingers with wooden frames. These weren't aberrations, they were routine steps in judicial procedure. Even scholar officials, trained in Confucian virtues, saw no contradiction. To them, truth was sacred. And if pain revealed truth, then so be it. Tattooed for life. For those who committed medium-level crimes, like fraud, repeated theft, or desertion, jail time was rare. Instead, punishments were public and permanent. A criminal might be branded or tattooed on the face, usually with characters indicating the offense: thief, traitor, liar. These marks served not just as punishment, but as a lifelong warning to others. Imagine walking through a marketplace and seeing someone's face literally spell out their shame. In feudal China, you couldn't outlive your past, it was written on your skin. Exile, punishment and displacement. Exile was another common sentence, particularly for those with political ties or high-status backgrounds. But this wasn't a vacation, it was a forced march across mountains, deserts, or swamps, usually to a remote frontier town. Exiles were stripped of wealth, family, and titles. If you survived the journey, you lived in isolation, often among foreign tribes or criminals. Some never made it. Others spent their final days as ghost-like figures, banished from everything they had ever known. For many, exile was considered a fate worse than death. Public executions, theater of terror. When crimes rose to the level of treason, murder, or rebellion, justice took center stage, literally. Public executions were not only permitted, they were encouraged. Deterrence came through display. The beheading block stood in the town square. Crowds gathered to watch. Drums beat. The condemned knelt. And the blade fell with ritual precision. But even that was merciful compared to the most feared punishment of all, lynching, or death by 1,000 cuts. In this horror, the body was slowly sliced apart, limb by limb, flesh by flesh, while the victim remained conscious for as long as possible. It was less about punishment, more about erasing a soul from memory itself. Families of the accused were often forced to watch. Guilt by association. In many cases, justice didn't stop at the individual. If someone was accused of treason, their entire family, sometimes their entire village, could be punished. Wives, children, cousins, even neighbors were arrested, questioned, tortured. Properties were seized. Names were blacklisted. This practice of collective punishment ensured that even the thought of rebellion died quickly. Everyone policed each other. Silence became dangerous. Loyalty was survival. Law as a weapon of the powerful. While the law was harsh for commoners, it was also uneven. Rich merchants might buy off an investigator. A scholar official's son might escape with a fine. But a starving farmer who stole rice could lose a hand, or a head. Corruption was embedded in the system. Officials were supposed to be models of virtue, but many abused their power to settle scores or build influence. Justice depended not just on law, but on relationships, bribes, and fear. And yet, people endured. Some believed that harsh laws kept society in order. Others simply had no choice but to obey. Order by oppression. Feudal China's legal system wasn't designed to promote freedom or reform. It was designed to maintain stability at all costs. And in some sense, it worked. Despite the cruelty, despite the blood, dynasties lasted for centuries. The streets were mostly quiet. People knew their place. Justice wasn't blind, it was weaponized. It didn't ask why, it declared how. And in doing so, it shaped an empire that feared chaos more than cruelty. Everyone was watching, life under the all-seeing eye. In feudal China, the concept of privacy as we know it today simply didn't exist. The fabric of society was woven tightly with eyes everywhere, watching, listening, and reporting. Whether in a small village or the vast imperial palace, your every move could be observed, and often was. Surveillance at the village level. In rural villages, where most people lived, social order was maintained not only by law but by a complex web of community surveillance. The village chief, often appointed by local magistrates, functioned like a watchful guardian, and sometimes a feared informant. Neighbors didn't just exchange pleasantries, they were expected to be alert to any suspicious behavior. A stranger passing through, a whispered rumor, or a late-night gathering could all raise alarms. People understood that their survival often depended on being seen as loyal and trustworthy. Reporting suspicion, a duty and a risk. It was not merely encouraged but considered a civic duty to report anything suspicious to authorities. Failure to do so could implicate you as complicit or disloyal. Informers were everywhere, and the boundary between genuine concern and opportunism was thin. For many, this created an atmosphere thick with mistrust and paranoia. Friendships were fragile, and alliances could shift overnight. The social fabric was as much about watching others as it was about being watched yourself. Informants and secret police. The government took surveillance to a new level. Spies, informants, and secret police were embedded within communities, marketplaces, and even households. These agents gathered intelligence on potential rebels, dissidents, or anyone who might disrupt the status quo. The secret police reported directly to local magistrates or, in more sensitive cases, to imperial officials. Their presence was often invisible yet deeply felt. Knowing that any word or gesture could be overheard or reported instilled a culture of silence and self-censorship. The palace, a fortress of suspicion. If life among the common people was marked by vigilance, the imperial palace was a pressure cooker of constant surveillance and intrigue. Within the forbidding walls of the Forbidden City, trust was a dangerous luxury. Eunuchs, court officials, and concubines all acted as eyes and ears for the emperor or rival factions. No one was truly safe from suspicion. The emperor's safety depended on knowing every secret and betrayal before it happened. To achieve this, a vast network of informers operated inside the palace, creating an environment where every smile might mask a hidden agenda. Consequences of being watched. This ever-present gaze affected daily life profoundly. People adjusted their behavior constantly, careful not to say too much or act too freely. Conversations were guarded. Even within families, what was spoken aloud could be carefully measured. Public displays of emotion or dissent were dangerous. In such a world, individual freedom was sacrificed for collective order. The cost was high, suspicion eroded trust, and the pressure to conform was relentless. The psychological toll. Living under constant surveillance bred anxiety and fear. People learned to police themselves, knowing the eyes of neighbors and officials could be anywhere. Some became cynical, others withdrew. Many accepted the loss of privacy as a necessary sacrifice to maintain peace and stability. Yet beneath this acceptance lay a quiet undercurrent of resistance and resentment, seeds that would, in later centuries, contribute to social upheaval. Legacy of surveillance. The all-seeing eye of feudal China left a complex legacy. While it maintained social order for centuries, it also stifled creativity, freedom, and trust. For the modern reader, it's a stark reminder of the costs of authoritarian control and the fragility of privacy. Marriage and obligation, a bond beyond love. In feudal China, marriage was not the romantic union many envision today. It was a strategic alliance, a transaction carefully orchestrated by parents to uphold family honor, secure economic stability, and maintain social standing. Arranged matches, duty over desire. From a young age, boys and girls were groomed not just to obey their elders but to fulfill predetermined roles, especially when it came to marriage. Parents selected partners based on family background, reputation, and dowries, the wealth or property the bride's family would bring into the marriage. Love, personal preference, or emotional compatibility were secondary considerations, if considered at all. Astrologers were often consulted to ensure the couple's birth dates were compatible, reflecting the importance of harmony not just between two people but between two families and their fortunes. The bride's new world. Once married, a woman left her birth family to live with her husband's household, often a multi-generational family with strict hierarchies. Her role was clear: to serve her husband, his parents, and manage the household. Respect and obedience were expected, sometimes enforced by tradition and sometimes by rigid social pressure. Women's identities became tied to their duties as daughters-in-law, mothers, and caretakers, rather than individuals with personal ambitions. Polygamy and concubines. While women were expected to be loyal and devoted, their husbands often had more freedom. It was common for wealthy men, especially officials and landowners, to have concubines in addition to their primary wife. Concubines held a lower social status, and their children were usually considered less legitimate, but they served important roles, providing heirs and sometimes political alliances. This system reflected the patriarchal nature of society, reinforcing male dominance and the control men held over family and property. Divorce, a rare and stigmatized option. Unlike today, divorce in feudal China was extremely rare and heavily stigmatized. Once married, couples were expected to stay together for life, regardless of personal happiness or abuse. For women especially, divorce meant social ruin and economic hardship. A divorced woman often had nowhere to return and little support. Only under the most extreme circumstances, such as proven infidelity or failure to produce a male heir, might a divorce be considered, and even then, it required family approval and legal procedures. Marriage is a social contract. Marriage was less about two individuals and more about bonding families and preserving social order. Dowries and bride prices were part of complex negotiations reflecting wealth and status. Marriages could cement political alliances or resolve family disputes. Women's personal desires were secondary to the family's interests, and breaking a marriage contract was often seen as a threat to the wider community's stability. The weight of obligation. For both men and women, marriage was the start of a lifelong commitment, not just to a spouse but to a network of duties, expectations, and social roles. The pressure to produce male heirs was immense, as sons carried on family names and inherited property. Women's lives were often confined to the household, and their value was measured by obedience and motherhood. Men balanced their roles as heads of households with responsibilities to their families and the state. Reflections on marriage in feudal China. This system ensured continuity and order in a society where personal freedom was limited, but it also meant many lived without the choice or voice we associate with love and partnership today. Marriage, in this context, was a pillar of feudal society, a contract binding families, reinforcing hierarchies, and sustaining traditions that endured for centuries. Rebellion and repression, the price of defiance. Despite the strict order and heavy surveillance that gripped feudal China, unrest simmered beneath the surface. Peasant uprisings erupted repeatedly, born out of desperation, injustice, and unbearable hardship. But these rebellions were met with a swift and brutal hand, showing the lengths to which the imperial government would go to maintain control. The roots of revolt. Life for peasants was harsh. Heavy taxes, forced labor on state projects like canals and walls, poor harvests, and corrupt local officials all contributed to widespread suffering. When survival itself became a daily struggle, the bonds that held society together began to fray. Outbursts of anger turned into organized revolts, as peasants tried to resist oppression and demand relief. Though rebellion was dangerous, the hope for a better life fueled these desperate acts. Government's ruthless response. The imperial government had little tolerance for dissent. Once a rebellion flared, authorities acted quickly and decisively to stamp it out. Military forces were deployed with orders to crush uprisings brutally. No mercy was shown to those who dared defy the emperor's rule. Collective punishment. Families and villages pay the price. What made the repression particularly cruel was the practice of collective punishment. If even one person in a family or village was involved in rebellion, entire households or communities could be punished, often with execution, exile, or confiscation of property. This policy aimed to deter others by making rebellion a risk not just for the individual, but for their entire social network. Public executions and fear as tools of control. Executions were often public and brutal, designed to instill fear and demonstrate the consequences of defiance. The infamous death by 1,000 cuts was one of many horrific punishments used to deter rebellion and enforce loyalty. The cycle of violence and resistance. Repression only deepened resentment among the oppressed. Some peasants returned to rebellion despite the risks, creating a vicious cycle of uprising and crackdown. This tension contributed to the slow erosion of the feudal system over centuries, as pressures for change built beneath the surface. Legacy of rebellion and repression. These uprisings and their harsh suppression paint a picture of a society struggling to maintain order at any cost. The state's willingness to punish entire communities highlights the brutal nature of power during this era. For modern readers, it's a sobering reflection on the human cost of authoritarian rule, and the resilience of those who resist. Inside the Forbidden City, where power was a dangerous game, while the fields of rural China were filled with the sweat and struggle of peasants, the capital pulsed with a different kind of tension, one woven from silks, secrets, and strategy. Behind the high red walls of Beijing's Forbidden City, the seat of the emperor's power, life was anything but peaceful. This was the domain not only of the Son of Heaven but of countless others who orbited his throne, ministers, eunuchs, concubines, and imperial relatives. And unlike the straightforward suffering of the countryside, the palace was a web of rivalries, betrayal, and political survival. The wrong whisper, glance, or gesture could mean ruin, or death. A palace built on appearances. On the surface, court life appeared serene and ceremonial. Elegant halls echoed with the soft rustle of silk robes. Marble bridges spanned carefully crafted waterways. Gold and jade shimmered under sunlight streaming through ornate wooden screens. Rituals and etiquette dictated every movement. But beneath the elegance lay tension sharper than any blade. Every official had an agenda. Every smile might conceal a threat. The emperor, surrounded, yet isolated. Although the emperor sat at the pinnacle of power, he was often isolated within his own court. Surrounded by flattery, misinformation, and manipulation, emperors were both revered and deceived. The inner court, dominated by eunuchs, castrated men entrusted with managing palace affairs, often controlled access to the emperor. Over time, some eunuchs gained immense power, acting as gatekeepers and puppet masters. Ministers from the outer court resented them, creating deep rivalries. The emperor had to walk a razor's edge between trusting his advisors and avoiding manipulation. A single misjudgment could destabilize the realm, or cost him his life. Concubines and the battle for influence. The emperor's harem was another battlefield. Imperial concubines lived in splendid isolation, yet were deeply involved in the politics of succession and court alliances. Bearing the emperor's son could elevate a woman from obscurity to power, But that path was fraught with competition, sabotage, and lethal gossip. Jealousy among consorts sometimes erupted in poisonings, frame scandals, or mysterious deaths. The lives of these women were luxurious yet perilous, caught in a game where beauty and cunning determined fate. The scholars and ministers, virtue and politics collide. Outside the palace walls, scholar officials, many of whom had passed the grueling imperial exams, saw themselves as guardians of morality and order. But inside the court, even the most upright minister could be dragged into palace intrigue. False accusations, secret alliances, or political purges could destroy careers overnight. Those who dared challenge corrupt eunuchs or royal relatives often met with imprisonment or execution, all under the guise of preserving harmony. Ironically, those who tried to remain morally pure sometimes became victims of the very system they sought to uphold. Silence and survival. In the Forbidden City, silence was a virtue. Speaking too boldly, showing ambition, or even aligning too closely with the wrong faction could spell doom. Many officials survived by keeping their heads down, watching, listening, and waiting. Trust was a rare and dangerous luxury. Spies lurked among servants, eunuchs, and even concubines. Letters were intercepted. Conversations were overheard. A courtier could never be sure who might report their words, or distort them. Ceremony as control. The endless rituals and formalities weren't just for show. They served a powerful purpose, to keep everyone focused on tradition, hierarchy, and appearances, distracting them from power plays happening in the shadows. Even the smallest ceremonies had layers of symbolism: where to stand, how to bow, what colors to wear. Breaking with protocol was seen not only as disrespect, but as potential rebellion. A beautiful gauge. Life in the Forbidden City was both a dream and a prison. The walls were high, the roofs gilded, the courtyard serene. But everyone inside was trapped in a system where loyalty meant surveillance, where luxury hid danger, and where ambition could be fatal. Some dreamed of escape. Others plotted their ascent. Many simply tried to survive. The palace was more than a seat of power. It was a stage for human drama, where every act was watched, judged, and often punished. In the end, the Forbidden City wasn't just the emperor's domain, it was a mirror of the entire feudal system, hierarchical, rigid, and merciless to the unprepared. You were not a person, you were a role. In feudal China, identity wasn't something you crafted. It wasn't about dreams, ambitions, or self-expression. It was assigned to you, by your birth, your gender, your class, and your family's status. Personal desires didn't matter. The system did. If you were born the son of a farmer, you would die a farmer. If you were a daughter, your future belonged to the husband your parents chose for you. You weren't raised to ask, "What do I want?" You were taught to ask, "What does my family, my society, or my emperor need me to be?" The state's human inventory. From the imperial court down to the smallest village, people weren't seen as individuals. They were resources, units of labor, tax revenue, and military strength. Bureaucrats kept meticulous population records, not to celebrate the diversity of their people, but to ensure maximum efficiency and control. A village wasn't a place of community, it was a ledger entry in a tax book. A child wasn't a bundle of potential, they were a future contributor to the state machine. Human lives were data, calculated and controlled. No room for selfhood. The concept of the self as we understand it today, independent, expressive, deserving of autonomy, didn't exist in the Confucian order. You were expected to mold yourself into the perfect role, the obedient son, the virtuous wife, the loyal official, the hard-working farmer. Deviation from these norms wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. To express individuality in dress, speech, or ambition could invite punishment. Society thrived on predictability and conformity, not creativity or rebellion. Freedom was submission. What Americans might consider freedom, the right to pursue happiness, express opinions, or make personal choices, was practically incomprehensible in this world. The highest form of honor was not forging your own path but perfectly fulfilling your assigned one. Confucian ideals placed harmony above all else. And harmony came from knowing your place and staying in it. A good life wasn't one where you achieved your personal goals, it was one where you performed your role without complaint. Voices unheard, dreams unspoken. There were no journals of dissent. No love poems between social classes. No memoirs of a peasant who chose a different life. If people imagined more for themselves, they rarely said it aloud, and they certainly never acted on it. For women, the boundaries were even narrower. A wife who wanted to learn, travel, or lead would be met with ridicule or worse. Her virtue lay in obedience, silence, and service. Even her face was often hidden from public view. Children were extensions of their fathers. Their thoughts didn't matter unless they were loyal. Their futures were predetermined. A boy might dream of becoming a scholar, but unless his family had the means to fund his study, that dream was stillborn. A machine with no exit. The structure of feudal society was self-reinforcing. To question it was to question order itself. People who pushed against their roles were often seen not as visionaries, but as threats, enemies of harmony. Those who rose, such as through the imperial exams, did so not by rejecting the system, but by mastering its rules to perfection. Even success was a form of submission. This didn't mean people were robots. They loved, feared, laughed, and mourned. But those emotions were kept within the boundaries set by ritual and hierarchy. To be fully human, to think freely, choose freely, and live freely, was not part of the design. A system that outlived the soul. Over generations, this ideology became so deeply ingrained that it stopped feeling like oppression. It became culture. People didn't just submit, they believed. This is what made the system so powerful. It didn't need chains or prisons to control people, it only needed expectations. And so, a child in a village would look at the stars and wonder, but only for a moment. Then he'd get back to work. Wondering wasn't his role. His role was to farm. Or to serve. Or to die in war if called. The unseen cost. To a modern American, this may feel unbearable. The idea of being denied agency, voice, or identity cuts against everything we value. And yet, for centuries, this was normal for millions. What did humanity lose in that system? What inventions weren't dreamed? What revolutions of thought never took root? What stories were never told? We may never know. The archives of feudal China are full of numbers, titles, and edicts, but rarely of hearts. The individual was erased, their uniqueness flattened under the weight of duty and obedience. Legacy of a silenced majority. Today, China's past is often remembered for its grandeur, great walls, intricate art, profound philosophy. But beneath the brushstrokes and bricks lies a quieter story, a civilization that thrived by silencing most of its people. Not through hatred, but through ritual. Not through violence alone, but through social design. As we admire the scale of its achievements, we must also remember the cost, the millions who were never allowed to be more than a role in someone else's empire. A legacy of contradiction, greatness at a price. Feudal China was a paradox, a civilization that dazzled the world with brilliance while binding millions in systems of obedience and silence. It built wonders and made breathtaking advancements in science, art, and philosophy. Yet it did so within a structure that offered very little personal freedom, brutal social rigidity, and unforgiving justice. Looking back, it's clear, the same system that gave us some of humanity's greatest innovations also silenced countless voices in the process. The genius within the cage. China's contributions to world history are astounding. Gunpowder changed warfare forever. The compass reoriented navigation. Paper revolutionized knowledge sharing. The printing press emerged centuries before Gutenberg's. The Great Wall, stretching over 13,000 miles, remains a jaw-dropping symbol of collective effort and state power. These achievements didn't emerge from chaos, they were the product of a civilization that valued order, discipline, and central control. Scholars studied rigorously. Artisans trained for decades. State resources were organized with precision. Even commoners, through sheer labor, built cities, canals, and palaces that still stand today. And yet, for every scholar who passed the imperial exam, thousands failed. For every craftsman who left behind a legacy, countless more died unknown. The system didn't aim to nurture individual greatness, it demanded conformity and punished deviation. Innovation without liberation. That's the contradiction. China was advanced in many ways, but not in how it treated its people. Most innovations weren't born from freedom, but from necessity or imperial demand. A better plow meant more taxes. A faster way to print meant more propaganda. The genius of China's inventors often served the state, not the self. This distinction is crucial. In a society where ideas flowed upward only when approved, and talent had to align with the state's goals, the full spectrum of human creativity was never realized. Potential was filtered. Lives were directed, not lived. A society of bound possibility. From birth, your path was largely predetermined. Were you born into a farming family? You'd work the land your entire life. Were you a woman? You'd serve a husband and his family, your worth tied to dowries and obedience. Were you poor? You had almost no chance to rise, unless, against the odds, you became one of the few to pass the grueling imperial exam. This rigidity created a powerful machine, but also a fragile human landscape, where aspirations were buried and human stories flattened. Glory at a human cost. Even China's most celebrated accomplishments came at staggering human cost. The Great Wall, for example, wasn't just a symbol of protection, it was a graveyard of forced laborers. Tens of thousands died constructing it. Their names were never recorded. Their sacrifices were never honored. They were expendable, replaceable parts of the emperor's vision. It was the same with massive canal systems, palaces, temples, and armies. Each required immense human labor, often coerced. Every brick laid in splendor had the weight of human suffering behind it. Control over compassion. Feudal China valued stability above all. That meant controlling the population with laws, surveillance, and brutal consequences. Questioning authority, whether as a peasant, a scholar, or even a court official, could mean exile, torture, or death. Families were punished for the actions of individuals. Public executions weren't just punishments, they were lessons for everyone else. Compassion, when it existed, was often private. Public life demanded allegiance. The state expected devotion, not empathy. A culture that endured, a structure that fell. Despite its many flaws, the legacy of this era still shapes modern China and the world. Confucian respect for elders and education remains. So do the engineering marvels, literary classics, and philosophical insights. The values of hard work, discipline, and duty echo across centuries. But the hierarchical structure, the crushing social immobility, the state-first mentality, they did not last. In time, rebellion, foreign invasion, and internal collapse would challenge the system. Dynasties fell. The people eventually demanded more. Looking back with clarity, to understand feudal China is to hold two truths at once. It was brilliant, a culture of deep thought, technological achievement, and artistic beauty. It was oppressive, a machine built on the labor, silence, and suffering of millions. It's tempting to romanticize the robes, the temples, the wisdom of sages. But we must also remember the blood, the hunger, and the loneliness of those who never had the freedom to speak, love, or dream. The grandeur was real. So was the grief. What it means for us today. For an American reader, where individual rights and personal freedom are considered sacred, this history may feel both foreign and chilling. It reminds us that human progress doesn't just depend on intelligence or innovation, it depends on freedom. When people can speak, experiment, fail, and express without fear, that's when true greatness emerges. China's story is not just a chronicle of what was, it's a warning of what happens when the state grows too powerful, and the individual too small. As we celebrate the wisdom of the past, we must also commit to protecting the freedoms that allow such wisdom to grow. Final reflections, a civilization of light and shadow. In the end, feudal China stood as one of history's grand paradoxes, a land of towering achievements and devastating inequality. Its culture produced enduring wisdom, breathtaking art, and revolutionary innovations that continue to influence the modern world. From the compass to the printing press, from Confucian philosophy to monumental architecture, its legacy is undeniable. Yet all this brilliance came at a steep cost. For the vast majority, peasants, women, servants, and the voiceless, the price of maintaining this grandeur was submission, suffering, and silence. Individual freedom was sacrificed for social harmony. Dissent was punished. The system uplifted a few and crushed the many. It's easy to marvel at the beauty of porcelain, the elegance of calligraphy, and the precision of imperial bureaucracy. But behind those wonders were hands that toiled without choice, minds that were never allowed to speak freely, and lives that unfolded not by will, but by decree. Feudal China was not just a time and place, it was a system, both magnificent and merciless. To remember it honestly is to admire its achievements without forgetting the people it cost. Feudal China was a world of breathtaking beauty, and heartbreaking brutality. Behind every invention and tradition were real people, living under rules they didn't choose, paying prices we can hardly imagine. If this glimpse into the past made you think, made you feel, or opened your eyes to a world you never knew, there's so much more to explore. So if you're into true stories, untold histories, and the hidden lives behind ancient empires, hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and join me, Thunka, for more stories that bring the past roaring to life. This is Story Time, where every tale has a heartbeat. See you in the next chapter.